like Nickabrick the dwarf making deals with hags and werewolves, the Dank right has apparently decided that since liberals accused Trump of being Hitler and he got reelected, maybe we should go dumpster diving for some of his superpowers. The offer is self-confident white boys, political power, and dressing up werewolves with 80s shades. Introduction. So a few years ago, Lucy once again offered to hold the football for Charlie Brown. And by this we mean that homosexuality was offered to conservative Christians under the guise of quote-unquote gay celibate friendship and quote-unquote side B Christianity. A conference called Revoice was hosted by a PCA church with a tagline about helping LGBT minorities find a place in the church, including one talk about bringing queer treasure into the New Jerusalem. The same play is currently being run again, but this time on the dissident right, what some of us are calling the Dank right, or Reich, as the case may be. This is the black tapeworm attempting to attach itself to the dissident right, a wide-ranging coalition of folks fed up with the woke DEI left forcing their so-called tolerance on our kids with puberty blockers, drag queens, and lockdown orders. But like Nickabrick the dwarf making deals with hags and werewolves, the Dank right has apparently decided that since liberals accused Trump of being Hitler and he got reelected, maybe we should go dumpster diving for some of his superpowers. The offer is self-confident white boys, political power, and dressing up werewolves with 80s shades. The Dank Reich. The setup is what many are calling the post-war consensus, a broad agreement following World War II that the Holocaust was so evil and heinous that everything must be done to never again let that happen. The deep irony is that within a generation of that oath, the United States Supreme Court legalized a Holocaust against the unborn, which has dwarfed Hitler's cruelest designs. But much of the 20th century liberal project became intertwined with this post-war consensus, since Hitler perpetrated his evils in the false name of Christianity and did so in the name of blood and soil, family and nation. Love and loyalty of those sorts were framed as the great evils. The deliberate destruction of the Christian patriarchal family via the sexual revolution and secular statist multiculturalism were all part of that post-war project to avoid another world war and all the atrocities that came with it, which really was a Faustian bargain with the devil. In God's great kindness, the last 10 years have seen an increasing unmasking of this Marxist and communist agenda, with the LGBT jihad and social justice riots culminating in the COVID charade and BLM marches. Suddenly, burning down Minneapolis was acceptable, but Christians gathering for worship were being fined and persecuted. Even many so-called conservative Christians joined in elements of this statist gospel. Thus began the great redpilling moment. The 20th century liberalism project was not about freedom and tolerance and democracy. It was about a creeping totalitarian deep state trying to destroy our Christian way of life in the name of, checks notes, preventing World War III. And when you've been lied to about so much, it's tempting to think everything has been a lie. Was Hitler as bad as everyone says he was? Was America really the good guys? And when someone points out that a Jewish rabbi runs Pornhub, some Fed and 3 naive Anons on X start suggesting that maybe Hitler was onto something. Meanwhile, Islam continues to grow in cultural and political power in Europe and the UK, and straight-up Hamas-style anti-Semitism is on the rise in the West. It's against this backdrop that the conservative reformed world has been rocked by some of this as well. There have been attempts by kinists to infiltrate the reformed world for decades, marked primarily for their belief that mixing races is unnatural and sinful, or at the very least that we have some moral obligation to preserve the color of our skin. While Stephen Wolfe has characterized his Christian nationalism project with a careful, defined notion of ethnicity, a shared love of people, place, history, and ways of life, He appears to have left himself open to kinist types to attach themselves to his mission. In my neck of the reformed 100-acre wood, we have churches in the CREC where all of this is actually being flirted with. So this isn't academic or speculative at all. From Mein Kampf book studies to conspiracy theories surrounding Jewish cabals to secret discussion groups, don't tell the elders about this, multiple CREC sessions are actively engaged in ministering to people flirting with this gunk. This is why Douglas Wilson was already addressing all of this back in July, including referring obliquely to the now infamous Holocaust meme, mocking Jews for complaining about hard work. All of this is the backdrop for the Antioch Declaration, which was really needed regardless of whether the pastoral situation in Joel Webbon's church had blown up at all. In other words, for people to think that the Antioch Declaration or Doug Wilson's blog post or James White's podcast fire alarms are them being obsessed with one pastoral situation in Texas is to betray a massive myopia. You're so vain, you probably think this podcast is about you. Not hardly. There may be specific cracks in the dam we're noticing, but the real point is the massive flood of spite pouring down the mountainside toward the dam. T-levels or something else. In response to Doug Wilson's discussion of the Antioch Declaration on cross-politic, Joel Webbon suggested we drop the "Revoice for Nazis" phrase. He granted that if someone was actually harboring hatred for Jews in his heart but promised not to shoot up any synagogues, the phrase would be warranted. But Joel wondered what the use of it is when we're talking about guys questioning the post-World War II consensus, historical matters related to the Holocaust, or wanting to point out that Judaism is worse than many evangelicals think, etc. Revoice was about dudes indulging sodomite fantasies or at least gay cuddling. How is questioning the historical narrative doing anything like that? And the simple answer is, if that was actually all that was going on, Joel would be right. If all that was going on was historical revisionism, I would completely agree. The problem is that isn't the only thing going on. From Nick Fuentes to Candace Owens to Corey Mahler at the Stone Choir podcast, we have more than just historical opinions at work. I responded to Joel saying, "Joel, for whatever it's worth, I appreciate all of this, but let me throw one more scenario into the mix. What about the dude who doesn't think he likes guys at all? He just likes wrestling and weightlifting with the dudes, and he thinks that thrill he feels is his T-levels rising, when in actuality, there's something else going on. It's that same sort of thrill some of the guys get sharing Pit Viper memes and Samuel Holden White Boy Summer videos. The Revoice vibe is not just hate, it's also lust for a transgressive thrill. So no, unfortunately, we can't retire Revoice for Nazis until we're done flirting with Hitler and white supremacy. And I'm not saying you're doing that, but my threads say it's way too common in our circles. Cheers." Some people said this was me calling wrestling or weightlifting gay, but that would be dumb. Again, if all we are talking about is calm reasoning surrounding the historical evidence for particular historical claims, Joel would be right. But that isn't what we're talking about at all. We're talking about a spiteful resentment that animates the lives of these guys and their social media posts, threads, and replies. Let me underline this point one more time. Simple, rational, historical study and analysis full of the fruit of the Spirit is not what I'm talking about here. Please carry on doing responsible historical research in the joy of the Lord. Of course, you could still end up believing something false or untrue, but if you embrace historical falsehood honestly and cheerfully, you might not be eligible for certain jobs, but that isn't church discipline material. What I'm talking about is historical study with spite, historical discussion with a sledgehammer, historical discussions full of obscenity, rancor, and rage. And it really isn't as far from real gayness as many might think. Back in the Revoice days, I brought a similar point up about men obsessed with appearance and aesthetic details, and I had to make a similar distinction. Of course, a man who cares about his appearance is not necessarily being effeminate or gay, but there absolutely is a kind of obsession with appearance that is feminine and therefore effeminate. It is the glory of a woman to be beautiful. She is the glory of man. And yes, of course, a woman can be sinfully vain and sinfully obsessed with her appearance as well. But generally speaking, a man should spend less time in front of the mirror. Likewise, aesthetic details. Of course, there are godly and masculine musicians, artists, actors, craftsmen, and so forth, and they are of necessity concerned with aesthetics. But again, there's a kind of resentful fastidiousness that is unnatural and bending toward a metrosexual gayness. There is a reason why sodomy is so prevalent in the arts. It's not necessarily so, but there is a temptation there that needs to be flagged and warned against. A pastor that doesn't warn his parishioners about the homosexual temptations that will be faced in a theater department or art school or in women's collegiate athletics isn't doing his job. White boy flamer. But white boy summer has been the same sort of thing. First off, the whole thing is as gay as socks on a rooster. A bunch of dudes sharing pictures and memes of themselves in pit viper shades and calling each other kings. Talk about campy. And of course, I'm not saying that those things in themselves are any kind of sin. My point is that when people start doing things that are just a couple of ticks off, pastors need to notice and keep an eye on these things. And the thing to keep an eye on is a dark turn, a little bit of angsty poison, a snarl. And right on schedule, the Samuel Holden White Boy Summer video captured this perfectly. There it was, just having fun. All those carefully curated clips set to an emotionally moving soundtrack, gushing sentimentalism, and then, like a turd in a swimming pool, a shot of Hitler walking away and some fascist regiments goose-stepping, all woven into images of Americana Christian men standing up against woke nonsense. Some very well-meaning pastors have busted BS detectors, such that they can't tell when I just have questions, concerns, opinions, are actually cover for bitterness, spite, wrath, rivalry, and envy. If you think one brief shot of Hitler in an otherwise sappy callback to a different kind of America is not an act of spite, you're not paying attention. If you think laughing at a Holocaust meme is mostly harmless fun, there's a gold mine in Nigeria I'd like to sell you. Paul covered this with Timothy centuries ago. Quote, "As I besought thee to abide still at Ephesus when I went into Macedonia, that thou mightest charge some that they teach no other doctrine, neither give heed to fables and endless genealogies which minister questions, rather than godly edifying which is in faith. So do. Now the end of the commandment is charity out of a pure heart and of a good conscience and a faith unfeigned, from which some have swerved, have turned aside unto vain jangling, desiring to be teachers of the law, understanding neither what they say nor whereof they affirm." Unquote. That's 1 Timothy 1, 3-7. In the first century, Paul warned Timothy that the wrong sort of men desiring to become leaders will become obsessed with fables and endless genealogies, ministering questions, rather than godly edifying, pure hearts, good consciences, and faith unfeigned. Vain jangling is a great King James-ism, and it applies handily to much of what passes as discourse on social media. But notice what Paul warns against. Would-be leaders ministering questions. They just have questions is not enough information. Some men just have questions because they are sidling in for positions of leadership for ungodly reasons, and godly ministers in the tradition of Paul and Timothy are required by God's word to charge those men to shut up. However, some men are saying there's no sin in noticing that Jews run significant portions of the porn industry, or George Soros is a Jew who has funded many modern atrocities. And I would agree. No sin in noticing all by itself. Not at all. The sin is the noticing with 3 helpings of spite. The sin is noticing and throwing elbows. The sin is noticing and seething. Why do you keep bringing it up? Why does that guy keep posting about it online? Why are you on your 5th podcast about it? Why the metrosexual obsession? And when he says, "Oh, no reason, I'm just curious about history," all your pastoral hackles should be up. Why? Because of 1 Timothy 1. And then the pastor who's about to be exasperated with me says, okay, I asked him about it. I asked him if he harbors any bitterness against the Jews. And he said, well, maybe I did just a little bit last Thursday, but not anymore. I'm just really interested in the historical discussion. If you're a pastor and you think your job is done, you're a fool. If you were asking about porn and lust, would that really be the end of it? Bitterness is rarely a sin that self-identifies as sin, especially inside the church. People know they're not supposed to be bitter, so they try to cover it with Bible verses and pious excuses. I'm not bitter. I just have a righteous hatred for the damage the porn industry is doing to our young men. I'm not bitter. I'm just sick and tired of how Big Pharma has poisoned millions of Americans. I'm not bitter. I just like to use the serrated edge like that wolf, Douglas Wilson. Some of this depends upon the tenor of those replies, but some of it is right there on the surface, snarling and festering. Sometimes you really can't tell, and you simply warn the guy to be careful and watch out, but the guy mocking James White and Douglas Wilson doesn't need a follow-up exam. He needs a blunt rebuke to the face. He needs his pit vipers taken away along with the car keys to his X account. As I wrote in an article 5 years ago, evangelicals have often created something of a gay greenhouse, idealizing feminine piety and insisting that men imitate it with sappy Jesus is my boyfriend worship music, always sharing feelings and emotions, and often valuing feminine aesthetic and colors and tidiness and neatness, and then we're shocked when men start having strange temptations. The Dank right is in the process of doing the same thing with dissidence, rebellion, and spite. Sure, we're not full-blown white supremacists or Nazis, and maybe we're not technically kinists either, but we're side B Nazis. And again, let me underline the point. It is not questioning the historical narrative. The point is the angst, the wrath, the spite. And a bunch of us are seeing it in spades with X accounts that say things like 1689 and Reformed Calvinist and Theonomist and Christian Nationalist in their bios. Maybe they're all feds and bots, and I certainly hope so, but apparently they think our threads are good waters to fish in. Why is that, you think? Conclusion: necessary and unnecessary conflict. Many are saying that all of this is an unnecessary conflict, and I agree that there are folks that I consider friends who are not anti-Semites or racialists that I'm aware of, who have apparently decided to make this some kind of turf war. And to those brothers, I would underline my point again. This is not about historical study or revisionism. If you're reading up on Churchill, feel free to carry on so long as you're fulfilling all your other responsibilities, rejoicing in the Lord always, working hard, loving your wife, honoring your parents, and training up your children in the Lord. If it's a true hobby and you're full of the joy of the Lord, feel free. Just keep your eyes out for the wackos and don't get worked up when we're launching missiles at the wackos. If you're not a wacko, we're not shooting at you. And if you really care about honest historical research, you really should join us in scaring away the feds and wackos. They will only get in the way. But there are two other categories of folks out there. There are the folks who don't really care that much about the post-war consensus, but they have taken empathetic umbrage over the fact that Douglas Wilson and James White and others have pointed out this problem to others. These are probably the vast majority of the White Boy Summer fans who are generally happy people and thought that the Pit Viper memes were just good fun and feel that the Moscow mood caught a bad case of the boomer grumps. But the problem has never been the Pit Vipers or white boys having fun. Viva la white boys, as they probably say in France. The problem was the fanning of the transgressive lust, the angst, and the spiteful elbows being thrown. And again, if you don't know what I'm talking about, I refer you to the replies to Pastor Wilson and James White and myself on X. I know it's a tall order, but can't we figure out a way to have fun and mock liberals that doesn't also attract neo-Nazi sympathizers? Finally, while it may still be a fringe minority, there really are some full-blown anti-Semites and racists out there stirring up hatred and wrath. Here, I'm talking about the folks who are openly saying that Hitler was a Christian prince. The Holocaust really was just work camps that Jews complained about, and all Jews are evil scoundrels because of something in their Ashkenazi genes. That really is of its father, the devil, hating and murdering from the beginning. And we have no option but to continue the long war against that seed of the serpent. That is a necessary war, regardless of your religious or political affiliations.